I think as we have analysed over the last certainly 3 months, we meet today and have undertaken the analysis of the war in Iran under the shadow of a conflagration that, unless resolved by the working class, will engulf the world in a global conflagration. The United States imperialist assault on Iran, launched in the dead of night on February the 28th by the Trump administration, acting in concert with the Israeli regime of Benjamin Netanyahu, is not some distant event that we observe from the safety of the other side of the globe. It is a war in which Australia, under the Labor government of Anthony Albanese, is directly and materially complicit. Understanding that complicity, understanding why it exists and drawing the political conclusions necessary for the working class is what we have called this meeting to discuss. Firstly, let us begin with the war itself, because it is the axis around which everything else turns. The assault on Iran is a massive political crime. It is illegal under international law. It was launched without even the formal fig leaf of congressional approval, without a UN mandate, without any of the procedural trappings that imperialist powers have historically used to dress up their aggressions. Trump began the bombardment while most Americans slept. The pretext that Iran posed a nuclear threat was a fabrication on a par with the weapons of mass destruction lies used to destroy Iraq in 2003. Just 4 days before the strikes, Trump himself had boasted in his State of the Union address that the US had already obliterated Iran's enrichment program. The attack came, moreover, at the very moment when Iran was engaged in talks, in negotiations, and had expressed willingness to submit to international monitoring. Iran's foreign minister had publicly stated that a historic agreement to avert war was within reach. The United States chose war over a negotiated settlement. Those talks were a smokescreen, nothing more. In the 3 months of the war, there have been up to 6,000 killed. More than 400 hospitals and medical facilities have been damaged or destroyed. Over 125,000 civilian structures were hit, including 100,000 homes and 857 schools. The very first target struck by US bombs was an elementary girls' school in Minab, which killed more than 170 children. This is barbarism. It is a crime in the most literal and precise meaning of those words, and Trump has promised worse. He has vowed to send the Iranian people, 90 million of them, back to the Stone Ages where they belong. Not a single member of the Albanese government has uttered one syllable of condemnation of that threat. Not one. But to understand this war as something more than the expression of Trump's personal criminality or Netanyahu's regional ambitions, we have to examine it in its full historical dimensions. The war against Iran is not Israel's war imposed on a reluctant America. It is not the product of the Zionist lobby manipulating an otherwise benign foreign policy establishment. That narrative, echoed in various forms by sections of the so-called left, is a politically dangerous falsification. It detaches the war from any coherent analysis of imperialism and ends as an apology for American capitalism itself. If the problem were merely Zionist influence, then the solution is simply to remove that influence, leaving the entire structure of American imperialism intact and unchallenged. The truth, as David North outlined in his address to the 2026 International May Day rally, is that this war is the culmination of a distinct 35-year historical period that opened with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991. Understanding that period is essential to understanding what we are fighting against today. When the USSR was liquidated, the American ruling class proclaimed it as a historic triumph of capitalism. The end of the Cold War, it declared, cleared the way for the restoration of a US-dominated world order, the unipolar world, we were told. But this triumphalist appraisal was built on a profoundly false assertion of what had happened in the Soviet Union. What failed in the Soviet Union was not socialism, but Stalinism, the nationalist bureaucratic betrayal of October 1917. The program of socialism in one country that detached the Soviet state from the international working class and proved economically and politically bankrupt. The International Committee of the Fourth International, basing itself on Trotsky's analysis, had foreseen this outcome. What Gorbachev presided over was not the refutation of Marxism, but the consummation of the Stalinist betrayal. The bureaucracy, that gravedigger of the October Revolution, ended up as the most venal faction of the new Russian oligarchy. For American imperialism, the same underlying historical contradictions that had destroyed Stalinism produced a different but equally irreversible and inescapable response. For decades, US capitalism had been experiencing the erosion of its economic supremacy, the rise of German and Japanese industrial competition, and the emergence of China as a powerful economic force, the hollowing out of domestic manufacturing, and the mounting burden of trade and budget deficits. These were not problems that American capitalism could resolve through economic means. The only instrument it still possessed in overwhelming and unchallengeable preponderance was military force. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, removing what had been the principal strategic constraint on its use of that force, American imperialism unleashed what had become a 35-year campaign of unrelenting military aggression. The national debt, which stood at $5.8 trillion in 2001, is now approaching $40 trillion. The price of gold, that most fundamental measure of the dollar's value, has risen from $35 per ounce, fixed at Bretton Woods in 1944, to approximately $4,600 today, a decline in the dollar's real value of more than 99%. These figures are not footnotes. They are the expression in concentrated economic form of the accelerating crisis of American capitalism's global position, a crisis that no number of bombs dropped on Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, or anywhere else has been able to arrest or reverse. The wars of this 35-year period are not discrete episodes. They are component parts of a single continuous historical trajectory, the attempt by American capitalism to overcome through military violence a contradiction it cannot overcome by economic means. The contradiction between the global character of modern production and the nation-state system, within which capital accumulation and political power remain organised. It is the same contradiction that produced the two world wars of the 20th century. A third world war is already unfolding. The war against Iran is the sharpest expression of a global rampage by the Trump administration. The US-NATO bloodbath in Ukraine, aimed at destroying Russia, continues unabated. The illegal seizure of President Maduro in Venezuela, the bombing of fishing boats in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific Oceans, killing more than 200 people, the crippling blockade of Cuba, the threats of strikes against Mexico, the threat to seize the Panama Canal, Greenland, and annex Canada. These are not simply the acts of a madman, but the preparations by US imperialism for world war, directed above all against China, which is regarded as the chief threat to US hegemony. The war against Iran is accordingly not the product of any particular president, any particular lobby, or any particular miscalculation. It is the latest and most catastrophic expression of this trajectory. Iran has appeared as a top adversary in every US national security strategy statement since 2006. It has been subjected to covert operations, assassinations, crushing sanctions, and repeated military threats under Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama, Biden, and both Trump administrations. The war is, as Comrade North concluded, the culmination of a bipartisan policy of American imperialism pursued for more than 3 decades. And it is inseparable from what comes next. For the strategists of American imperialism, subjugating Iran is integral to the broader confrontation with China that Washington is preparing. The confrontation that represents the next and potentially final escalation of this 35-year trajectory. A confrontation with China that could, if not stopped by the international working class, culminate in nuclear war and the end of human civilization. The war against Iran is not the conclusion of the imperialist rampage, it is the opening of its most dangerous phase. The real aims of this war have nothing to do with Iran's supposed nuclear weapons and everything to do with who controls the oil of the Persian Gulf and through that, who controls the strategic gateway to Eurasia. The role of the Albanese government must be understood in that context. Within 3 hours of the initial strikes on Iran, Anthony Albanese was among the very first leaders in the world to endorse them, without any parliamentary debate, without reference to caucus, without any public consultation. He issued a declaration of full support. Albanese regurgitated every one of the lying talking points prepared by Washington and Tel Aviv. He declared Australia's support for the, quote, United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. He described the Iranian government as a destabilising force, repeating word for word the propaganda framework designed to obscure who the real aggressor is. He and Foreign Minister Penny Wong declared that the world would not mourn Ayatollah Khamenei, a naked endorsement of Trump's doctrine of simply assassinating the leaders of states that stand in the way of American power. But Labor's complicity is not only political, it's material. The Pine Gap satellite surveillance and war targeting base in Central Australia, operated jointly with US imperialism, almost certainly provided intelligence for the targeting of Iranian installations. The North West Cape submarine communications base connects Australian infrastructure directly to the US Pacific Fleet. And then in April, it was revealed that behind the backs of the Australian population, the Albanese government had secretly dispatched approximately 90 SAS commandos to join the war. It must be stated categorically, the Albanese Labor government is a war government. It is not a government that has been dragged reluctantly into a conflict it opposes. It rushed to endorse it. It has materially contributed to it. It has lied systematically about the extent of its involvement, and it will deepen that involvement further as the situation escalates. Meanwhile, polls show that 72% of the Australian population opposes the war. Those who express surprise at Albanese's conduct, who ask how a Labor government could rush to endorse a war crime within 3 hours of the bombs falling, have not studied or have chosen to forget the history of the Labor Party. The actions of the Labor government are not a departure from Labor traditions, but their continuation. The Australian Labor Party was founded in 1890, not on a socialist internationalist, but its explicit opposite, the White Australia policy, the doctrine of racial exclusion, and the subordination of the working class to Australian capitalism and the British Empire. As Lenin observed in 1913, the Australian Labor Party was, quote, the unalloyed representative of the non-socialist workers' trade unions, whose leaders were altogether peaceable, purely liberal, not a party of the working class, but in the essential Marxist sense, quote, an organisation of the bourgeoisie which exists to dupe the workers, close quote. Labor pledged the last man and the last shilling to British imperialism when the slaughter of the First World War began in 1914. It was in World War I that Labor Prime Minister Billy Hughes attempted twice to impose conscription on the Australian population and was expelled from the Labor Party only when he failed due to the opposition within the working class. It was the Curtin Labor government that, in World War II, presided over the decisive shift of Australia's primary allegiance from a declining British Empire to an ascendant American imperialism, a realignment that has defined Australian foreign policy ever since. That same Curtin government deployed troops to break dock workers and other strikes for the war effort. From opposition, Labor supported the criminal US wars in Korea and Vietnam. Bob Hawke's Labor government in 1991 joined the US imperialist forces in the First Gulf War. In 2001, while in opposition, Labor supported the invasion of Afghanistan and the 2003 invasion of Iraq, deepening Australian participation in both wars when it assumed office in 2007. It was Julia Gillard's Labor government that in 2011 signed Australia onto the US pivot to Asia, the vast military build-up directed against China, and it is the Albanese Labor government that is now completing Australia's transformation into what US strategists describe as the southern anchor and the central base of American imperialism's preparation for war throughout the Indo-Pacific. This is the real history of the Australian Labor Party in government and in opposition. Now let us discuss what this reveals about the political situation here, because the war, the political crisis, and the economic impact on the working class are inseparable. What we are witnessing in Australia is an acute crisis of bourgeois rule. The political establishment, the two-party system, of Labor and the Liberal National Coalition, which has administered Australian capitalism for the past 80 years, is fracturing. This fracturing is not primarily a product of internal party squabbles or individual personalities. Rather, it is the product of the ruling class's fundamental inability to manage the contradictions tearing the social order apart. The combination of imperialist war, escalating austerity, a cost of living catastrophe, and the growing alienation of the working class from every institution of official political life. The most visible expression of this, on the Conservative side, is the Liberal Party's existential collapse. At the 2025 federal election, the Liberals received their worst vote since the party's founding in 1944. They retained just 9 of 88 metropolitan seats. In the elections that followed, the Liberal Party's vote has not just declined, but been decimated. The party that has served as the traditional Conservative instrument of the ruling class in this country is by any objective measure on the brink of collapse and split. Significantly, Tony Abbott, former Liberal Prime Minister from a decade ago and representing the most hardline reactionary wing of Australian conservatism, is positioning himself to coalesce a far-right formation from the wreckage of the Liberal Party. Abbott's political identity is defined by militarism, economic reaction, social authoritarianism, and contempt for any constraint on the prerogatives of corporate power. His intervention in the present crisis signals that the sections of the ruling class are looking beyond the decaying structures of conventional conservatism towards something sharper, more aggressive, and more openly hostile to the working class. However, the beneficiary of this disintegration is not Labor, but the far right. One nation must be understood for what it actually is, not an outsider challenge to the political establishment, but a product of its disintegration and a weapon in the hands of the ruling class against the working class. Virtually all of one nation's central leadership is a direct product of splits and defections from the coalition. Hanson herself began her political career as a Liberal Party candidate, and all its central figures are former Liberals and National MPs. This is not a grassroots movement from below. It is the institutional right reconstituting itself in a more aggressively nationalist and authoritarian form. One Nation's program presents nothing but a scapegoat in the form of migrants, refugees, Muslims, foreigners, to be blamed for the devastation produced by a capitalist system that One Nation has no quarrel with whatsoever. This is the oldest trick of reaction. Direct the fury of those who have been dispossessed away from the class that dispossessed them and towards a manufactured enemy. And One Nation can do this only because the Labor Party and the trade union bureaucracy has spent decades creating the social conditions for it, gutting manufacturing, imposing austerity, suppressing strikes, promoting anti-immigrant nationalism, and leaving entire working class communities like Elizabeth in South Australia, where One Nation polled over 30%, destitute. Crucially, One Nation does not represent a break from Labor's agenda. On the war against Iran, on the genocide in Gaza, on the crackdown on democratic rights in the wake of the Bondi shootings, One Nation and Labor agree. Their differences are of tone and demagogy, not of substance. However, there is a growing concern expressed openly in the ruling class circles that Albanese is not up to the task the ruling class is placing before him. What is that task? It is to impose upon the working class the full weight of the economic attacks that the corporate elite demands, while simultaneously managing Australia's integration into a global imperialist war strategy. These aren't easy tasks. They require a government with authority, with the political capacity to suppress opposition, and with the confidence of the ruling class, and that confidence is not unconditional. The budget handed down this month by Treasurer Jim Chalmers is a case in point. It contains some of the deepest cuts to social spending in Australian history. The gutting of the NDIS, as Zach has gone through, $35 to $38 billion slashed over 4 years, up to 300,000 disabled people thrown off the scheme, every one of the 760,000 current participants subjected to new functional assessment tests designed to strip their support, is nothing but a social catastrophe. But the cuts to the NDIS represent only half the cuts imposed throughout the budget. That was a total of $63.8 billion in cuts. The rest have been camouflaged and barely reported. Yet buried in this savage anti-working class budget, Chalmers introduced minor changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax on property investment. Changes so marginal that the government's own figures show they will raise less than $1 billion a year and will do nothing to reduce property prices. The ruling class has reacted with outrage, even at this minimal symbolic gesture. The financial press, the business lobbies, and the Liberal opposition screamed that wealth is under attack, a ludicrous proposition. What the ruling class was signalling was that nothing is to be permitted, not even gestures towards taxing profits and wealth, not the most threadbare cosmetic adjustment to the most bloated property speculation regime in the developed world. Nothing will be tolerated. This rabid, disproportionate fury at such a minor measure is itself an expression of the crisis of rule. It reveals the brittleness of a class that has grown so accustomed to unconditional political service that it cannot tolerate even the appearance of resistance. It also places Albanese under enormous pressure. He is caught between the working class whose opposition to austerity and war is growing and a ruling class that demands total compliance and brooks no deviation. And there are also significant tensions within Labor itself. Chris Minns, the New South Wales Labor Premier, has made clear that he has deep differences with the federal leadership. His response to the Bondi Beach shootings of December the 14th last year was to immediately exploit the tragedy, convening an emergency parliamentary session to rush through legislation massively expanding police powers to ban protests and political slogans. This was done in close collaboration with Israel's Netanyahu. Minns' response signalled an ambition and a willingness to be more aggressively authoritarian, to embrace more openly the police state measures that sections of the ruling class believe are necessary. Minns and West Australian Labor Premier Roger Cook have both refused to endorse the Labor budget's tax measures. The suggestion that a Labor split is not out of the question is not far-fetched. The tensions are real. The laws rushed through in the wake of the Bondi shootings, combined with the broader battery of hate speech legislation that Labor governments have enacted over the past 2 years under the banner of combating anti-Semitism, add up to a systematic dismantling of the right to political expression and protest. These laws were initially directed at the mass movement against the Gaza genocide, one of the largest per capita anti-war movements in the world. But they are not only directed at that movement. They are being built as a permanent apparatus of repression to be used against the working class when the inevitable social revolt against war and austerity erupts. And now with the Iran war, deepening the cost of living crisis, fuel prices surging, inflation accelerating, the budget itself premised on the war ending quickly despite every indication to the contrary, the ruling class is hastening to prepare the instruments that it will need. The budget's own alternative scenario, buried in the fine print, acknowledges that if the war with Iran intensifies, oil could hit $200 a barrel, inflation would surge past 7%, hundreds of thousands would be thrown out of work, and the economy could contract. Albanese's budget is a fiction built on a ceasefire that Trump himself describes as having a 1% chance of living. So let us turn to the most important question. What must the working class do? The opposition to war, to austerity, to the dismantling of democratic rights is real and it is growing. As I said, the poll showing 72% opposition to the Iran war reflects a deep alienation from the course the ruling class and all its political servants are pursuing. Workers in healthcare, education, disability services, and across the public sector are already entering into struggles. The anger over living standards, housing, energy costs, stagnant wages, and against soaring prices is intensifying. But opposition without a political perspective, without an understanding of what this system is and why it produces these outcomes, and without an independent political organisation of the working class, will be dissipated or channelled into the dead end of appeals to Labor and nationalism. The trade union bureaucracies are not the alternative. They have been transformed over decades into instruments of corporate management and Labor Party discipline. These organisations do not fight for the working class. They suppress its struggles in the interests of the Labor government and the corporate order to which it is subordinated. In fact, the anti-democratic methods of the Labor government are being mirrored by the union bureaucracy itself. A stark example is that Comrade Zack outlined. The bureaucracy of the AEU in Victoria, which called off the teachers' strike action and is now bulldozing through an agreement that enshrines an effective wage cut and a 4-year no-strike clause, has now eliminated the right to vote for the agreement. The union leaders are now so terrified, so hostile of a no vote by its members that there will be no democratic vote. And they have a right to fear the upsurge and opposition of the working class. Throughout country after country, workers are engaged in mass political opposition. 3 general strikes in Italy, a general strike in Belgium, Portugal, Bolivia, and mass struggles in Turkey, the US, Europe, and more broadly. That is why the SEP calls for the building of independent rank-and-file committees in workplaces, factories and neighbourhood communities as genuine organisations of the working class and of its self-defence and struggle, operating outside and against the union bureaucracies. This requires the exposure and opposition of the organisations whose role it is to defend and justify the actions of these union bureaucrats and the Labor government. And those are the organisations that present themselves as socialist or progressive. Organisations such as Socialist Alternative, Socialist Alliance, the Greens, because the question of their role on the issue of war is decisive. A socialist organisation that does not oppose imperialist war is not a socialist organisation. That is not a polemical point, it is a definition. And by that definition alone, these organisations have disqualified themselves. The World Socialist website has documented that Socialist Alternative, the largest pseudo-left organisation in Australia, responded in its publication Red Flag to the launching of the war in Iran with, on the first day, a single brief comment, then 9 days of silence. When it did speak, it offered no political perspective, no call to mobilise the working class, no analysis connecting the war to the broader crisis of capitalism, and it covered for the Albanese Labor government by falsifying its record and downplaying its active participation. A month into the war, Socialist Alternative held its annual Marxist conference, during which it reportedly held nearly 150 sessions. Not one session was dedicated to the war on Iran. This is not incompetence, it's not a mistaken omission, it is a political line. And the reason for that line is that Socialist Alternative has spent more than a decade openly supporting imperialist wars under humanitarian cover, backing the US-NATO regime change operation in Syria, cheering on CIA-funded Islamic forces against Assad, with Socialist Alternative leader Corey Oakley declaring in 2012 that the time for, quote, knee-jerk anti-imperialism had passed. Oakley explicitly described Iran as an imperialist power, playing the imperialist game in the Middle East. And this is the pseudo-left's characteristic method, labelling the targets of American imperialism, Russia, China, Iran, Syria, as imperialist, in order to justify either active support for or passive acquiescence in the wars waged against them. The Greens play a parallel role. While posturing over Gaza, they have been among the most vocal proponents in the Australian Parliament of the US-NATO war against Russia in Ukraine. And their criticism of the Iran war is channelled entirely into appeals to the very Labor government that is an active participant in the crime, a dead end by design. These organisations speak not for the working class, but for an affluent, upper middle class layer that has made its peace with imperialism, pursues its privileges within the framework of capitalism, and whose function in the current period is to prevent workers and young people from drawing the political conclusions that the situation demands. The SEP's opposition to them is the elementary precondition for building a genuine anti-war movement. To stop the war requires the mobilisation of the working class as an independent political force, in a direct fight against the Labor government, in conscious solidarity with workers in the United States, Iran, Israel, Britain, Europe, and every nation internationally. That is the perspective of internationalism. It is the perspective that was founded by Leon Trotsky in the Fourth International in 1938, in the shadow of the last great descent of capitalism into World War and fascism. The lessons of that period are not historical curiosities. They are the most urgent political guides for the present moment. Comrades, we do not meet today in easy times, but we meet with a clarity that no other political tendency can offer. We know that this war is a criminal act of American imperialist aggression, backed in full by the Australian Labor government, which, if not stopped, threatens a third and existential war against humanity. We know that war abroad means war against the working class at home, a policy being strenuously pursued by the Labor government. We know that the budget is a brutal transfer of resources from the sick, the disabled, the unemployed, and the working poor to fund the war machine and the corporate elite. We know that the Bondi Beach laws and the anti-protest legislation are part of the construction of a police state apparatus that the ruling class is preparing to use against the social revolt it knows is coming. And we know that the working class is not a passive victim of these processes. The working class is the only social force in society capable of stopping this descent into war. If it is armed with a revolutionary political perspective and organised independently of every wing of the capitalist political establishment. That is what the Socialist Equality Party is fighting to build. We urge every worker and young person in this room and beyond, online, to take up that fight. Read the World Socialist website, engage with its analysis, join the SEP, participate in the construction of rank and file committees in your workplace and your community. The alternative to the road of war, austerity and authoritarian repression is not the utopia of a better managed capitalism. That will never happen. It is socialism, the international unity of the working class in the struggle to take political power and reorganise social life on the basis of human need, not private profit, and the imperatives of a declining imperialist order. That fight is not somewhere in the future. It is the demand of the present moment. Thank you.